or good morning, everybody. This is Mark Millam with you, and I'm glad that you decided to join us today as we talk about our Flight Safety Foundation GSIP program, or Global Safety Information Project. Greg Marshall's with me today, and together we've been at this for a couple of years now. Greg, would you like to say hi to everybody?
Thanks, Mark, and hi, everyone. Good to be here with you all today.
Greg and I are staff members, and we get involved with all the technical work at the foundation, and this project has certainly kept us busy. Improving safety is getting much harder in this industry, but it never stops being interesting. At Flight Safety Foundation, we really want to help the industry continue to improve its already stellar safety record. I say it gets harder to improve things because in today's world where so much has already been done with technology in the aircraft, the airports, and air navigation, and where training programs and procedures have safeguards that have already captured a lot of the lessons learned from other accidents, and where safety management systems are widespread within many organizations, you really have to be on your game. This is our second time offering a webinar about GSIP, and so we're going to assume that most of you know something about this, but we will check in and just find out in one of our polling questions. Our invitations did go out to people and organizations that have worked with us before in the focus groups and workshops in Pan America and Asia Pacific. They also went out to Flight Safety Foundation membership. So with that as our assumption, we're going to jump into things very quickly and make the most of your time. If you haven't heard much about this project, I would encourage you to visit the flightsafety.org website and review the GSIP pages and documents that we already have out on display. We've got 2 annual reports there and some of the first documents covering our toolkits. Our focus today is the first in a 4-part series on GSIP. We plan to be holding 3 more webinars, and we'll get back to that and the dates on that later. We hope this interaction helps you think through your own practices, but also your discussion, questions, and comments today will help provide us with some better insight. One other note before we start, you'll notice a status bar at the bottom of the page along with a slide count. This will provide a position marker when anybody tries to review a recorded replay of this webinar. We won't release the slides separately, but if you're viewing the recording, this will allow you to jump around quickly to get to any part of the webinar. So our plan today is to take you through the highlights of our GSIP toolkit at its most basic level. On our agenda, we've already started our introduction, and we plan to cover good data collection, data analysis, sharing information results, and protecting information. Our follow-on webinars will deal with these same areas, but each time at deeper levels of intensity. We'll wrap up today with a conclusion on today's webinar and then open things up for questions and discussions. I say that because Greg and I might not have all the answers, but what you're thinking may lead us into something for further consideration on our toolkits. So let's make the most of that discussion. And let's start with the first polling question. I'd like to find out a little bit of what kind of stakeholders are with us today. So if you could take a look at this question and answer from your perspective, who would you say you're most representing? I'm getting about well over 90% of the votes in, so I'll close the poll and I'll quickly share that back with everybody. This is our second time doing a poll today, but it's interesting to see the difference here. Commercial scheduled airlines, the biggest proportion. That's followed by regulators, and about 20% other operators, with the smallest share on some other industry stakeholders. So good to see that, and a little bit different than the way we experienced it this afternoon. Greg's shaking his head a little bit, and yep, we know that most of those folks this afternoon were in kind of an other operator category. All right, I'll let Greg get us going with the next part of this.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, and that's a much closer spread of excuse me, stakeholders represented here, although the ANSPs aren't represented. Okay, so to carry on, I'd like to just take a moment to remind everyone on some of the takeaways that came from our previous focus groups and workshops. A large number of those who met with us said that they were tracking safety performance of the top critical safety issues according to that which is published by, for example, ICAO. But as this is broken down between the stakeholders, the airlines are the ones that are doing the major portion of this through their own safety management system programs. Collaboration on safety data is happening at some levels, but there is a lot of opportunity to improve because so many are hesitant to share what they have. And not many stakeholders trust each other about understanding the risk if they haven't seen the data that actually shapes that risk. Airlines would like to know more about the results on mandatory safety reports to their regulators, and very few good summaries exist of this particular type of data. Involuntary safety reporting programs are widespread even where there is little legal protection of the data. Thankfully, we found almost no new examples where this data has been used for prosecution or litigation purposes. As we know, should that ever happen, the data flow is bound to plummet. We also learned that more needs to be done to form collaborative efforts between all stakeholders. And we're working on offering the industry more detailed toolkits encouraging this effort, and we're going to walk through elements of the most basic level here today. So let's have a look at safety. Many years ago, safety was handled somewhat differently than what it is today. Accident investigations were necessary to identify cause or causal factors. Rules were established to drive consistency and, importantly, compliance. Checklists were the norm, and all of these things were good to drive industry towards necessary safety improvements. Today, safety has become a bigger part of everyone's job, and to practice safety is to learn and study what is going on in day-to-day operations. Many are expected to get involved in study and analysis that will help to map out new methods to improve risk mitigations. Also, there is a great deal more work done to promote a conscious culture about safety, recognizing that issues can't get solved without good ideas from lots of people. So there are a number of perspectives in play at this time that are worth mentioning. But while things like technology have affected all industries and safety has improved, the things that stand out in the aviation industry are the collaborative nature and the effort already underway to take safety data and use it in operations and design. And for the regulator, the use of rulemaking and enforcement as a primary tool for improving safety is being supplemented with today's adoption of safety management systems. Yet there are challenges in conducting both. Some talk about these two things competing with one another as if safety programs should relieve the regulator of conducting oversight. Here at the Flight Safety Foundation, we certainly don't believe these are competing, but rather they're complementary, and both may need to change in order to get them to work alongside each other effectively. Safety is an evolving process. Every time we make improvements, not everything is solved. It is getting harder for industry to determine what the next accident type is likely to be because there are so many risk fronts. Reliability and safety curves are showing points of diminishing return. Still, the top safety accident areas are pretty consistent. We see this with controlled flight into terrain, loss of control in flight, and runway safety. So there are some specific areas to work improvements. Automated systems have solved some problems but have exposed new challenges to monitoring aircraft states. So as safety data grows, we need to ask ourselves, are we getting the right answers to the challenges that we face today?
So today we'll cover some materials that we have in mind for our GSIP toolkits at the very basic level. We gathered this as a result of our research and study in the Pan American and Asia Pacific regions. If you've read some of our reports, you may know several inconsistencies surface as separate organizations gather data and conduct their own analysis. The processing of that data is done differently depending on the organization. The information sharing is limited in some areas but quite extensive in other areas, with some global safety databases but not containing all operations or all stakeholders' information. Protecting this information from purposes other than advancing safety is still not robust and consistently applied across all countries. Legislation, rulemaking, and policy adoption is still necessary. We'd like to take our next poll now and find out a little bit about your background and knowledge on GSIP. So I'm going to launch this poll and ask you to answer. Is this have you seen GSIP before? And if so, let us know. But it's okay even if this is your first experience. Looks like we've got about a little over 70% of the folks have responded. Now we're up to 82%, 86. I will close this. We're over 90%. I'll share this back with you. And good to see we've got a lot of returning folks from our focus groups and workshops. Looks like some people have also taken a look at our materials on flightsafety.org. Others have heard of us, but there's also a good share of folks that this is their first experience. So we'll keep that in mind as we proceed. And this time I'll make sure I hide the results here before we get back to our slides.
Okay, so let's start with collecting good data. We'd like to first cover some different types of data and the sources for that data, and maybe a few terms that we also covered it in our focus groups and workshops. Data is generally considered to be basic and unorganized until such time as it is processed. Once processed, data becomes information. Information can be considered facts derived from the original data. Knowledge is gained from the cumulative gathering of information and becomes the power behind what can be done to improve performance. So in some ways, one person's results of organizing data to provide information can become another person's or organization's data that is further organized to provide even more information. So let's begin our discussion on collecting good data by understanding safety and risk from a typical and more traditional method, such as fatal accidents. There are a few reputable sources for fatal accident data. Both ICAO and IATA publish annual safety reports that tabulate the worldwide accident rates and specifically describe the portions related to fatal events. ICAO regional aviation safety groups also publish annual reports for their regions. And a few civil aviation authorities publish their own safety reports or post public information summarizing their annual statistics and often sort them by accident category. The Aviation Safety Network, which is an associate partner of the Flight Safety Foundation, hosts an annual safety review of the world's occurrences, and we use their database to summarize in our own way what we believe to be the top global aviation safety issues. In the table displayed on this slide here that you can see, we show the top fatal accident counts over the past 5 years. Now there are slight differences from some of these lists and for most stakeholders, that doesn't much matter. Sorting out the exact number is not as important as understanding what each of the top categories are when you're looking for data that describes risks. The industry is big and mature enough to work risk improvements in all these areas. Most of us also know we will work general accident risks alongside fatal accident risks. So runway excursion risks are often not fatal, but certainly deserve our attention. If you looked at this same list prioritized by accident category, you would find the runway safety for approach and landing would probably rise to nearly the top of the list. The Foundation doesn't create such a list, but the IATA and ICAO reports do, and they address the specific rates of occurrences in all of these categories. Now, there are others, like insurance providers, that do more with their safety reports, but after that, the list of reports gets short pretty quickly. When you're working in safety in this business, these are the recognised organisations keeping an eye on industry performance, and the public access to this data is invaluable for organising how you might decide to collect hazard information. So next we want to cover some of the other terms that describe data that is used within the industry we have covered. We covered this in the description of our toolkits on our public site. We've grouped this into the following categories: public safety information, safety program information, and reportable occurrences. Safety program information is further broken down into safety assurance and employee safety reporting. The public safety information is much of what we had just previously described. It's the accident and incident investigation reports that have been made publicly available to the industry. Many civil aviation authorities and investigative authorities have published this on their websites, and we just mentioned many of the organisations that summarise those results in their annual reports. Safety program information is usually what a service provider is doing to monitor its own operations, whether they're through audits, inspections, and other recorded and measured data, or through employee safety reporting, for example. And the reportable occurrences are what is already documented and passed between industry and the regulator. As one of the steps in trying to decide or regularly assess the hazard information available, we think it's useful to consider everything that the industry may want to examine, and think of this as a tool to organise what you might be after. Now, along the top header here are the safety data source types, and along the left column are the top safety risk areas, and you can vary this however you decide to examine them. The next two columns are who is the accountable department, or who's the accountable organisation, and who is the supporting department or organisation. Then in each of the other cells is a description of what kind of data and reports are collected to stay informed about hazards in these areas. Now, you may find as you take inventory on this just where your weaknesses are and how they might be improved by additional new programs or targeted studies. This is a sample as it might be viewed as an airline, but it could also be used by other stakeholders as well. In our toolkits, we suggest you consider creating this kind of data collection map to really understand what is available and what could be used, and then tap into what you can use. As you improve your processes, you may continue to incorporate more data. It's important to note what kind of data is being gathered, and each of these has its own limitations. So in terms of auditing data, it's good to take a snapshot in time on the results against a standard. A finding or observation describes something that was not expected, but this depends on how clear the standard is, how consistent the auditors are, and it does not measure process for which there is no exposure to some situations. With survey data, it's largely attaining perceptions. It's good for knowing common perceptions, but not so good for knowing actual performance or risk. Voluntary reports or data obtained from those reports is more descriptive about how the concerns develop and in what situations, but not always reliable without consistent and dependable reporting processes. For example, TCAS RAs. Many airlines detect these events far more than they are ever reported. With measured data, more specific and consistent means of measuring performance is attained, but is less capable of telling why something worked or didn't work.
We think another way to think of the risks you want to look for is to break it down into key elements of your process and consider what data is available at each stage. This chart represents the birth to death cycle of the aviation business and what must be done to set up operations, with arrows representing where some information is being passed between stakeholders. It gives you a sense of where the industry can have some impact to safety and who is trying to successfully influence good results. But to take a closer look, it's necessary to break this down into more detailed processes. Each of those processes is an opportunity to consider safety data that could be gathered.
So here's a very simple example, and this involves the preparation for flight, and it might look something like this. So if you have a look at this, it's broken down into various elements: flight crew training, cabin crew training, aircraft maintenance, reservations and passenger handling, and so forth. So if we move to the next stage and have a look at what data may exist, you can see there are things such as training records, maintenance records, passenger counts, flight distance, fuel load, and so on. Take this to the next stage, have a look at audit data. We can see that audit data comprises of findings, causes, risks, hazards, risk categories, compliance issues, and so forth. And if we move on to the next stage with voluntary data, we can see that we can gain information related to management, contractors, suppliers, governance, and so forth.
Now let's look at it from a flight operations perspective when we're moving aircraft from one airport to the next. This timeline indicates the specific phases of those operations. And the same is true in terms of the different types of data here. You'll find that there is often measured data that can include things that are captured through a flight data monitoring program. It can include audit data. It can include voluntary safety reports coming from a variety of different staff, and even survey data.
So good data comes from a variety of sources, and what we are suggesting in the toolkits is to think of what processes and programs are out there detecting hazards, and they can all be prioritized as your organization and process grows. Now, each is a potential source of safety data. Let's turn to look at analyzing this data, and there are three things we'd like to talk about in this section. Firstly, setting performance indicators or key performance indicators. Secondly, assessing hazards to determine risk. And thirdly, conducting investigations. When looking at safety performance indicators or key performance indicators, it's helpful to think about this in terms of top-level expectations. But let's recognize there is no perfect measure for safety. There are a number of different metrics that can provide some portion of an indicator of the organization's expectation for safety. And these indicators are commonly shared widely within your organization so that every department has a stake in the safety success of the organization. If you are an airline, you might think about establishing these indicators based on the major operating departments and their functions. You need to understand what you are expecting from each, and the table above shows potential answers for each of those departments. From that, you might look back at the data you have in your data collection inventory and begin to match what data streams might tell you most accurately and what you're trying to measure. But again, there's no right answer, and we also believe what you start measuring may not be what you continue to measure as you determine what provides the most leverage on making improvements. And we recommend these are re-examined annually or of some other regular frequency, since your management learns better metrics for gaining leverage. So the next area we'd like to discuss has to do with applying risk assessments to all of the data streams you took inventory on. This can be one of the most daunting tasks in a large organization in the setup of a safety management system. In order to get everyone on the same page, this takes some careful thought and consideration before you train everyone on how to use it. The risk assessments use a simple tool called a risk assessment matrix. Now, most of you have seen this in the past, or different variations of it. But getting everyone to use it consistently requires some thinking. And we believe one of the most important steps is to consider a way to more fully describe and customize the scales on both the severity and probability. Some organizations have thought about customizing the severity scale, something like this. This is essentially assessing risk in various contexts. So this isn't just thinking about what happens to the aircraft and passengers, but also what happens to the company and its long-term, potentially its long-term sustainability. And this is an actual example of an organization structure for custom descriptions for each of those contexts. They then went through and spent the time for each cell in the table, and that guides all the employees when applying the risk matrix in those various contexts. Now, likewise, in order to simplify the probability side of the matrix, it's important to take the terms frequent, probable, remote, etc., and put this into something much more specific and meaningful. For an organization where a flight schedule is fairly predictable, this could be transformed into terms that are more easily interpreted across the organization. Then, when both scales are customized with an organization's own guidance, the consistency of application becomes more reliable.
In the basic level of our toolkits, we also talk about the typical forms of analysis that help provide perspective on the top-level risks and what trends have shown for the history of each safety issue. These illustrations are common and generally apply across all levels of data summaries. Whether a whole organization or a group is reviewing the safety status, the relative priority of the risks should be communicated, and the history of its improvement during that period that mitigations have been applied. We should mention that one of the key issues to making valid assumptions about the data is how well the data quality is managed. One cannot provide conclusions without making sure the data is both coming from relevant sources, but there is also safeguards that prevent containing errors or omissions. It can't be assumed that all databases are the same level or quality, and we made some suggestions in the toolkits on what must be done routinely to examine the data as it's gathered, but also to conduct sanity checks on the results on some of the summary analysis. Often there are specific events that require some more detailed analysis of what went wrong. Every organization should have a means of conducting a thorough review of why something significant went wrong. At an industry level, we have guidance that provides us recommended procedures and protocols on accident investigations. But within an organization, there are events that require investigations even when it's not requiring a report to a regulator. We suggest each organization has criteria that establishes when these investigations are required, but also explain the guidance on how the investigation should be conducted and what's being used to get to a real root cause. Some investigation recommendations we're making are being used in many different industries industries, not just aviation. A common and general approach often cited in descriptions of root causes suggests mapping out why an event took place, looking at all the tentacles that could lead to that, and then asking why the failure happened, and then asking after that why that took place. And after several iterations, you'll find a deeper root cause. It's often said that asking 5 times gets much closer to something that can be a potential root cause and a credible solution. Separately, perhaps, it's best to think in terms of broad elements of the process that are supporting producing a product. As we've shown in this fishbone diagram, those elements might be materials, methods, machines, measurements, environment, and people. Now you can create a similar or slightly different structure that's more detailed and aligns better with your operations. But we want to stress the importance of having a documented process to write down the results of that investigation, demonstrating that all the elements that were explored as potential contributing factors. So far we've mentioned the importance of safety performance indicators, quality analysis, and solid investigation. We'd like to walk you through one other example of what should really be going on behind the effort to understand what your data is telling you and how using it in your risk management process is done to improve performance. Remember, we're usually starting from very good performance and trying to make it much better. So imagine you're measuring the exact landing position on a runway over the course of thousands of operations. You might find a distribution curve that looks like the above. And on this, aircraft are landing from the right towards the left on this chart. Now let's say you've not had any accidents or incidents. However, we know there's still a small probability of landing short or landing long, and how that might lead to some sort of undesired event. Those probabilities can be very small, but they can change considerably if you get outside or well outside the acceptable or target landing zone. Let's say this is the specific safety metric you're working to improve. You might be seeing good results, and you're attempting to make it even more reliable. In many operations, there's a similar distribution of performance like this, and most of your operation is operating in a good region or an acceptable portion. Your overall statistics show there's not really any accidents or incidents, and with the current distribution, you may not be in an imminent threat of one happening. Still, you're trying to improve the long-term performance. In the acceptable part of this chart, you are showing, in the unacceptable part of this chart, you're still showing some activity, but nothing has escalated to a significant failure or undesired outcome. The probability that any of these will lead to an accident is still very low. Yet it may be only a matter of time or enough flights that one of these produces a bad outcome. So our measurements may need to look carefully at these distributions and measure them over time, and as we implement mitigations, we follow the results. Hopefully what you're achieving is, as those mitigations are applied, you see an interim result where that distribution curve starts to sharpen and progress further to something that's more peaked, and ultimately we're satisfied when almost nothing remains in an unacceptable area and the entire distribution is in an acceptable range. This is an example of proactive work. It doesn't wait for something to go wrong, yet it recognizes that flights are happening outside an acceptable boundary. We hope the recommendations in the toolkits we're offering focus heavily on using data like this to understand where to drive solutions and getting them to new performance levels that your organizations are setting as an expectation. And this is a comment or a concept that we intend to carry forward through other levels of the toolkits. You don't want to wait for accidents and incidents, but you can still work to reduce the events that happen in the tails of the distribution curve.
Okay, so let's have a look at information sharing. We've spent a lot of time discussing collecting the right sets of data and doing solid analysis, but doing that is only some of the first steps in getting a better understanding on what to do about it and making sure everyone who has a responsibility for safety understands the latest safety information that's available. In the basic level of our toolkits, we focused almost exclusively on sharing that information internal to your organization. It's important to make sure all operational groups know things such as what their safety performance indicators or key performance indicators and what is the target for improvement. What are the top priorities in safety and how do they relate to each division within an organization? And as the year proceeds, how well are we meeting these performance improvements? And we also want to talk about the other important communication that can take place about safety information at different levels within the organization itself. So we suggest that an employee safety reporting system is a foundational program for the basic level of our toolkits. So communicating its existence and assuring there is good communication underway about that program is an absolute imperative. That means that managers must educate their employees and make it easily available, as well as ensuring there are good methods of acknowledging what is being submitted through these processes. In order to continue to improve the quality of the information, we've described some materials in our toolkits around how this communication may also consider some constructive feedback on what was useful and what else could have been helpful if the submitter could have explained more. In order to spread the knowledge and information in larger organizations, it may be necessary to form safety teams that do their best to digest the safety information that's being received and be engaged in the kinds of analysis that needs to be explored. Now, ICAO makes a distinction between safety review committees and safety action groups. These teams also are the ones that can help to form a critical review and discussion on the analysis conducted so far and where it might need to go deeper, recognizing where data is available or may still need to be gathered to supplement the analysis of current risks. These are the kinds of things we expect those safety teams may be asking of themselves and others involved with specific risk areas. Now, of course, the overall program must be shared at the highest levels within the company on a regular basis. While there might be a more frequent safety report that is circulated amongst the management team, we believe that briefings and updates to the accountable executive are also happening as discussed in most safety management systems guidance that is publicly available. It's during these sessions where the senior manager can give his or her perspective on understandings behind the data and asking what must still be explored to confirm an understanding of the data and when the mitigations will take effect and should be recognizable in the subsequent safety data. The senior safety manager is perhaps at the same time making sure what is learned from one safety team is being shared with other safety teams to improve the data gathered and the quality and effectiveness of mitigations that are being pursued.
That's good, Greg, and sometimes you can't overstate the value of having critical discussion amongst the safety team and having that carried out by the senior safety manager. Lastly, we'd like to mention what can be taking place with protecting this data. We just got done talking about sharing it, but remember, sharing of data must be in a manner that protects individuals who are participating in the safety programs with good intentions. Most safety professionals know about constructing safety processes according to just culture concepts. At Flight Safety Foundation, we are often very public about our support for these principles. In the aviation industry, as we mentioned early on, we have a robust level of checklists and procedures and high expectations on conducting operations to the greatest degree of safety. If employees are also working to those expectations, the data gathered for safety should be used for advancing safety and not to identify blame or direct punishment. And we recognize there may be exceptions. There may be situations where someone may be hiding the truth or operating knowingly in an unsafe manner. We don't look to protect everyone blindly. Yet if anyone admits they've made an honest mistake, there ought to be provisions for protecting those individuals, especially when they're seeking to allow others to learn from their mistake. These kinds of principles are in line with just culture concepts and key concepts we reinforce through our toolkits. These are some of the basics we touch on in this part of our toolkits. Organizations should really understand what acceptable and unacceptable behavior is and define it. Voluntary safety programs to report safety hazards and concerns ought to have assurances from the company that it's not going to be used against an individual. This is different than protections from a state, but we would also advocate that states should do their best to adopt policies to protect these individuals when the company has defined what acceptable and unacceptable behavior is. Voluntary disclosure programs are good methods for gaining understanding on risk and ought to be used by states to seek getting good information on risks that are actively being managed by a company. The protections for the company should help to promote these kinds of programs and be protected against taking enforcement actions. Many of these protections really need to be supported by state and regulatory rules, and we expect to offer some ideas of what model rules and legislation looks like. And to protect individuals and gain the trust where labor organizations are in place, it makes sense to have them involved in the process and part of the safety action groups that are seeking risk reductions. The protection practices in de-identification and keeping confidences here is also something that doesn't happen well without a lot of practice. Too often there are temptations to lay blame or embarrass someone for errors and mistakes committed that are often expected in the course of operations, but can be improved if the trust between the participants is kept high. We realize that some of this is considered a soft skill, but it's nonetheless very important as organizations collect safety reports from people and measure activities that show exactly how an individual performed his or her duties.
So let's discuss once again the 4 parts as we've discussed in the basic level of these toolkits. We're trying to advance the industry and help to foster improvements to, for example, the inconsistencies surface as separate organisations gather data. So I'll go back to that. We're trying to foster improvements where the inconsistencies surface as a result of separate organisations gathering data and conducting their own analysis. Also, the processing of that data is done differently depending on the organisation. The information sharing that is limited in some areas but quite extensive in other areas, with some global safety databases, but not all operations and not all stakeholders' information. And protecting this information from purposes other than advancing safety is still not robust and consistently applied across all countries. Legislation, rulemaking, and policy adoption is still necessary.
I was just reminded I wasn't speaking too well. Thank you for responding to the poll. This is our last polling question, and looks like we've got most of our responses already in. So thank you for that. I'll close the poll, and I'll share it back with you. A little bit more of an even split. Strongest on data collection, which was different from our earlier experience on this same webinar. But then also fairly strong on information sharing and data analysis, with maybe some confidences on information protection that's a little bit stronger than the other 4 areas.
I think, yeah, I think earlier it is. It's an interesting split. I think in our earlier poll with our previous webinar, I think we saw
information sharing was really high.
Yeah, and information protection was something that was deemed to be. Yeah.
Okay, well that helps us, and sometimes we like to understand a little bit better on the regional perspective. So I'll take that down, and we'll keep moving in terms of this webinar. Let's say a little bit about what we hope to cover in some of our future webinars. We mentioned that we're going to cover some of the same basic activities, but in these next webinars, we expect to get a little deeper in some of the levels of intensity. And so, for example, on level 2, or the next webinar, we expect to, we got a message that we lost audio. Let's just double check. I'm getting signals and showing signals that we've got audio. Can you hear me, Greg?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. All right, we're going to press on, assuming that audio is good, and maybe somebody's connection got interrupted. But in the next webinar, we expect to cover more in terms of flight data management programs, more detailed analysis of that data. We'd like to talk a little bit more about introduction of bow tie analysis. In the third level, we increase that data to things to include LOSA programs and looking at various different data streams and what you can learn from multiple sources, and then applying that through bow tie, which we believe allows and sets up perhaps some better capability for information sharing. And lastly, working to get data collected, analyzed, and shared across the industry to do some really powerful things that a few areas of the world are already starting to do. And then we'd like to make sure that as we go through each of this, we can talk about some things that are more specific to different types of key stakeholders. In each section of our toolkits, we try to emphasize what's really necessary for success and the key priority focus areas on your processes. So as we review what we covered today, in the data area, we would emphasize the use of data collection maps and the triggers for investigating certain events, data quality work, and the roles in who is gathering and collecting data. On the analysis side, we've talked about the use of safety performance indicators, data sanity checks, having a structure for conducting an investigation and getting to root cause, use of some specific analysis tools, and the risk assessments that we mentioned, not only following a matrix but customizing it so that it's easily and readily interpreted. On sharing results, we've focused mostly on internal sharing of those results throughout an organization, use of safety teams and communication there and feedback to employees, and to consider partners in what's going on there, such as a regulator. And lastly, on protecting the data in the process, details in terms of de-identification practices and policies internally, and support from a regulator and the labor organization involvement. These then become a bit like a key checklist for building good programs and having the right elements of those programs to be successful.
Okay. For those who would like to access the draft toolkits, you can do so on the Flight Safety Foundation website in the GSIP section. Now, to get access, you must have a Flight Safety Foundation membership. For those of you that have participated in the past in one of our workshops and have provided us with information about your programs, we've set aside a temporary membership access to our site. And we want you to examine what we've developed so far, and we'd really value your feedback as to what's been produced. We'd like you to be able to see what other organisations have considered for safety performance indicators and help us by telling us what you might be doing today. Now, the survey takes about 20 minutes or so, but we think it would give you better insight into the safety performance indicators from other organisations across our entire GSIP project. If you go, you can access that by going to the survey link in the handout. You see the dates for our future webinars in the handouts. They're all published there. For those that have registered for this webinar and all other members, we will send new invitations. Yet if you want to plan for these now, please see the link and go ahead and place them on your calendar. Lastly, if you want to give us some constructive feedback on our toolkits and this process that we've been following with our webinars, please see the membership center link on the handout to provide that feedback to us.
So we actually posted these on this slide, and you'll find those same links in the handout, but you'll find a little bit more detailed instructions that you can follow for getting access to this. So that pretty much concludes our